Staff Sergeant Bobby C. Franklin, Private First Class Benjamin L. Freeman, Command Sergeant Major Jerry L. Wilson, Specialist Marshall L. Edgerton, Specialist Christopher J. Holland, Specialist Nathaniel H. Johnson, Staff Sergeant Ricky L. Crockett, Sergeant William J. Normandy, Master Sergeant Thomas R. Thigpen Sr., Private First Class William R. Strange, Airman First Class Antoine J. Holt, Specialist Justin W. Johnson, Specialist Marvin A. Camposolis, Private First Class Marquise A. Whitaker, Equipment Operator Third Class Christopher M. Dickerson, Lance Corporal Juan Lopez, First Lieutenant Tyler H. Brown, Sergeant Foster Pinkston, Sergeant Robert S. Goodwin, Sergeant Kelly L. Courtney, Lance Corporal Michael P. Scarborough, First Lieutenant Dan T. Malcolm Jr., Sergeant Jonathan B. Shields, Lance Corporal Jeffrey S. Blanton, Sergeant Benny Washington, Private First Class Jesus Fonseca Jr., Lance Corporal Darrell J. Schumann, Sergeant First Class David J. Sally, Corporal Taylor J. Dickens, Sergeant John E. McGee, Sergeant Charles C. Gillikin III, Corporal William A. Long, First Lieutenant Noah Harris, Sergeant Chad M. Mercer, Hospital Corpsman Third Class Travis L. Youngblood, Sergeant John F. Thomas, Sergeant James O. Kinlow, Staff Sergeant Carl R. Fuller, Specialist Jaquez E. Brunson, Specialist Benjamin B. Yehuda, Sergeant First Class Victor A. Anderson, Sergeant Ronnie L. Shelley, Staff Sergeant David R. Jones, Sr., Sergeant Jonathan C. Hagan, Specialist Matthew V. Gibbs, Sergeant First Class Charles H. Warren, Specialist Jerry L. Gainey, Jr., Private John M. Henderson, Captain Jeremy A. Chandler, Sergeant Thomas J. Strickland, Specialist Joshua P. Dillinger, Sergeant Paul A. Saylor,
Sergeant Michael J. Stokely, Chief Warrant Officer 2 Dennis P. Hay, Staff Sergeant Robert L. Holler, Jr., Staff Sergeant R. Drawn, Jr., Staff Sergeant Dennis P. Merck, Staff Sergeant Joel P. Dameron, Sergeant Tyrone L. Chisholm, Steelworker Third Class Emory J. Turpin, Corporal William G. Taylor, Staff Sergeant Philip L. Travis, Sergeant Philip A. Dodson, Specialist Marcus S. Futrell, Specialist Joseph A. Lucas, Sergeant Dominic R. Coles, Operations Specialist First Class Michael A. Jordan, Staff Sergeant Ricky Scott, Lance Corporal Joshua A. Scott, Sergeant First Class Amos C. Edwards, Jr., Lance Corporal Samuel W. Large, Lance Corporal Kun Y. Kim, Specialist David S. Collins, Staff Sergeant Marion Flint, Jr., Hospitalman Zachary M. Alday, Specialist Channing G. Singletary, First Lieutenant Ashley Henderson Huff, Staff Sergeant Carlos Dominguez, Private First Class Kenneth E. Kincaid IV, Lance Corporal James Chamrowan, Staff Sergeant James D. Ellis, Specialist Justin R. Jarrett, Lance Corporal Stephen F. Johnson, Lance Corporal Christopher C. Warren, Private First Class Daniel J. Allman, Command Sergeant Major Donovan E. Watts, Sergeant First Class Dexter E. Willis, Captain Hayes Clayton, Corporal Victor M. Langarcia, Corporal Richard O. Quill III, Specialist Christopher K. Boone, Specialist Jonathan K. Smith, Corporal Brian L. Chevalier, Staff Sergeant Blake M. Harris, EOD First Class Diver Joseph A. McSween, Sergeant Randall T. Marshall, Specialist Jerry R. King, Staff Sergeant Michael R. Hollander, Sergeant Jason R. Harkins, Corporal Jeffrey D. Walker, Sergeant Brian D. Ardrun, Private First Class Robert A. Worthington, Lieutenant Colonel Glade L. Felix, Staff Sergeant Stephen J. Wilson, Staff Sergeant Darren P. Hubble, Airman First Class Jason D. Nathan, Lance Corporal William C. Chambers, Sergeant Jean L. Lamai, Sergeant Jerry L. Deloach, Sergeant Benjamin B. Bartlett, Jr., Specialist Daniel E. Gomez, Specialist Kristen Rojas Gallego, and Captain Corey P. Tyler.
Specialist Edgar E. Cardenas, Corporal John C. Tanner, Specialist Christopher G. Patton, Sergeant Michael C. Hardigree, Specialist John J. Young, Corporal Joshua H. Reeves, Master-at-Arms Seaman Janicia M. Gresham, Staff Sergeant Gregory L. Elam, Information Systems Tech 2nd Class Menelik M. Brown, Lance Corporal James M. Gluff, Corporal Evan A. Marshall, Staff Sergeant Donald T. Tabb, Corporal Miguel A. Baez, Sergeant Corey E. Spates, First Sergeant Luke J. Mercadente, Staff Sergeant Sean J. Whitehead, Master Sergeant Davy N. Weaver, Sergeant Steve A. McCoy, Master Sergeant Mitchell W. Young, Corporal Jonathan R. Ayers, Corporal Matthew B. Phillips, Cryptologic Technician 3rd Class Matthew J. O'Brien, Private 1st Class Tyrone V. Hobbs, First Lieutenant William K. Jernigan, Private Coleman J. Meadows III, Command Sergeant Major Benjamin Moore, Jr., Specialist Ryan C. King, Private Thomas E. Lee, Sergeant Jeffrey W. Jordan, Sergeant 1st Class John C. Beal, Major Kevin M. Jenrette, First Sergeant John D. Blair, Lance Corporal Charles S. Sharp, Specialist Isaac L. Johnson, Sergeant Brock H. Chavers, Specialist Anthony M. Lightfoot, Specialist Raimundo P. Morales, Captain Matthew C. Freeman, First Lieutenant Joseph D. Helton, Gunnery Sergeant Edwin J. Johnson, Staff Sergeant Aaron M. Kenneflick, Staff Sergeant Alex French IV, Sergeant 1st Class Sean P. McCloskey, Staff Sergeant Vernon W. Martin, Chief Warrant Officer 4 Michael P. Montgomery, Sergeant Brianne T. Williams, Private 1st Class Jaisha L. Pauley, Specialist Bruchon X. Alexander, Private 1st Class Jason H. Estepanal, Specialist Matthew D. Huston, Sergeant Lakeisha M. Bailey, First Lieutenant Robert W. Collins, Staff Sergeant James R. Patton, Sergeant Jonathan K. Penny, Specialist David A. Holmes, Lance Corporal William T. Richards, Sergeant Johnny W. Lumpkin, Private 1st Class Jacob A. Dennis, Staff Sergeant Sheldon L. Tate, Sergeant 1st Class Edgar N. Roberts, Private 1st Class Chad D. Coleman, Lance Corporal Christopher B. Rogers, First Lieutenant Scott J. Fleming, Senior Airman Michael J. Barras, Senior Chief Cryptologic Technician David B. McClendon, Corporal Stephen C. Sokolowski, Lance Corporal Raymond L. A. Johnson, Specialist Shannon Chihuahua, Private 1st Class Austin G. Staggs, Lance Corporal Joseph R. Geis, Private Jeremy P. Faulkner, Specialist Gary L. Nelson III, Specialist Cynthia R. Taylor, Specialist Robert G. Teeney, Private 1st Class Bryce M. Scott, Specialist Mark J. Downer, Staff Sergeant Keith F. Rudd, Lance Corporal John R. Wimpy Cagle, Specialist Adrian G. Mills, Captain Nicholas S. Whitlock, Sergeant Edward Kohler III, Sergeant Sean E. Dressler, Lance Corporal Scott D. Harper, Private 1st Class Jonathan F. Davis, First Lieutenant Jonathan P. Walsh, Lance Corporal Stephen G. Sutton, Private 1st Class Brandon D. Goodine, Staff Sergeant Alexander G. Pavlaitis, Specialist Erica P. Alexson, Major Walter D. Gray, Specialist Hilda I. Clayton, Sergeant Stefan M. Smith, Sergeant Eric T. Lawson, Staff Sergeant Joshua Bowden, Specialist Joshua J. Strickland, Sergeant 1st Class Omar W. Ford, Specialist Matthew T. Cox, Private Stephen A. Blake, Specialist Matthew W. Ward, Staff Sergeant Jason A. McDonald, Private 1st Class Montarius T. Daniel, Lance Corporal Squire Skip Wells, Specialist Kyle E. Gilbert, Senior Airman Casey E. Ruiz, Staff Sergeant Chester J. McBride, Jr., First Lieutenant Weston C. Lee, Specialist Etienne J. Murphy, Staff Sergeant Dustin M. Wright, Specialist Octavius D. Lakes, Jr., Hull Maintenance Technician 1st Class Paris S. Poe, Private 1st Class Barry D. Sutton, Sergeant Patrick S. Tainch, Lieutenant Christopher C. Short, and Master Sergeant Mark Allen. May these heroes never be forgotten.